My name is Tom Pereira. I'm a retired professor of neuroscience, and I often have to travel to Europe. Usually I travel on an airplane, but this year I decided I would take a trip on one of the ocean liners, and there are only a few left to travel on, and I decided to go to Europe on the Queen Mary 2. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that. But before I do, let me show you how I made my decision. When I traveled by air, I typically took my wife with me. And being quite old, I generally flew in business class. And this took about a day. And so if you go by air, one day, two people, one way, costs roughly $5,000. And for that, you get one night, 2.5 meals, and a lot of jet lag. So let's compare that to what happens when you go on an ocean liner. Let's take the Queen Mary 2. If you go mid-class, and that's sort of the equivalent of business class, it's not first class, it's not coach, it's middle. You get 7 days and two people and one way. And amazingly, it costs about the same amount of money, $5,000, plus or minus whatever you can work out in the way of special deals and so on. And for that, you get an amazing 7 nights in a luxurious hotel, 42 meals, and no jet lag. So if you have the time, I think it makes a lot of sense not to go by air if you have time to travel on one of these grand old ocean liners. So let me talk a little bit about crossing the ocean. We're talking about a 3,000 nautical mile journey from New York City to London, let's say, or Southampton. And 3,000 nautical miles is about the distance when you drive from New York City to San Francisco. So it's a pretty hefty trip, and it can be a little rougher than when you drive from New York to San Francisco. The North Atlantic, you see at the top of this diagram, is one of the roughest ocean regions in the entire world. I've talked to a lot of sea captains and asked them what they thought was the roughest area that they'd ever been through in the ocean. And they've highlighted three areas, and the North Atlantic is one of these. One of them is off the tip of Africa, and it was originally called Cape Fear. But it scared sailors so badly that they refused to sign on ships that were going around Cape Fear. So they renamed it the Cape of Good Hope. The other really rough area in the ocean is the trip around the tip of South America, in what is called the Drake Passage between South America and Antarctica. And this is an area known as Cape Horn. You're traveling around Cape Horn. And Cape Horn is an amazing area. It is the home of literally thousands of shipwrecks that didn't make it around, and thousands of sailors have died going around Cape Horn. And being a lover of adventure, I have been through the Drake Passage now a total of 6 times, hoping to experience some of these really, really rough seas. And in the upper left-hand corner, you can see a picture that I took of the roughest passage that I had. The seas were roughly 40 feet, and you can see an albatross there skimming the tops of the waves. I don't know how they do that. They're just out there for hours and hours and hours, many, many miles from shore. But Cape Horn can be really, really rough. Interestingly enough, one day I was going around Cape Horn and it was really, really calm, very unusual with Cape Horn. And you can see in the middle picture here how it looked from the air, picture of Cape Horn on a calm day. And it was so calm that I was actually able to climb out onto Cape Horn and climb up a trail that led to the Cabo de Hornos National Park, or Cape Horn National Park of Chile. And when you get up to the top of the hill that you see there, there's a lighthouse, and just hundreds and hundreds of monuments, grave markers, and memorial monuments for the thousands of sailors who lost their lives. It's absolutely amazing to be on top of Cape Horn and looking out. And when you do, you see these incredible wrecks all within vision of Cape Horn and all wrecked on Cape Horn. In the top center, you see an ocean liner that is wrecked, and on the top right, you see a typical sailing ship that wrecked. And as you look out, you just see these skeletons sticking up out of the water. So it's a very, very historically significant place because it is the resting place of so many thousands of sailors and ships. So what kind of a craft are we talking about with respect to an ocean liner? I have to make the point that an ocean liner is designed for rough weather. It's designed to get people from one place to another in relative safety and relative comfort. And it is not a cruise ship. A cruise ship is not an ocean liner. Cruise ship, as you can see, is very top heavy. It's not designed for very, very rough seas. And it is not typically a conveyance to go through these kinds of waters. Let's look at the very earliest crossing of the Atlantic to the New World, to America. And this was done by the Vikings. And here is a classic Viking boat, which has been recovered and preserved. The wood on the boat was actually dated through a very clever technique using counting the rings on the wood to date it. And they figured that this boat reached America in about 1362. Roughly 1362. The boat measures 60 feet long and it had 30 crew. Think of that. That's about 2 feet per crew member. Pretty rough. And it took 60 days to cross the Atlantic in this boat. It's really an exciting place. If you ever have a chance to get to Newfoundland, there is a Viking settlement there where you will see this boat, and they're still digging up the settlement. They're waiting until the technology improves so they don't damage any of the items that they're digging out of the Viking mounds where the Vikings docked in this first boat. But just imagine that trip. And talking about rough trips, how about Columbus? In 1492, Columbus sailed a boat called a carrack or a now. And it was 117 feet long, and it had 87 crew on board, and it took 36 days for Columbus to cross this really rough ocean. Now, just think of 87 people on this little boat. This is a model, exact replica and working replica of a carrack, and it is traveling around the world somehow. It stopped in various places in the United States, including Massachusetts and Key West, and you could go on board and see this. And really a very amazing thing about a carrack is that it has no keel, absolutely no keel whatsoever. It is totally dependent upon the weight, the rocks in the bottom of the boat for its stability. The weight in the bottom kept it upright, but at the same time, without a keel, it's virtually impossible for this boat to even sail across the wind, much less into the wind. So it was really quite dependent upon the kind of weather that it was faced with. And we move on to the Mayflower. Now, the Mayflower carried a lot of people to the New World in roughly 1620. And the Mayflower measured 100 feet long. And as you can see, it's not all that different in appearance from the carrack, and it carried 102 passengers, and it took 66 days to get to America from Europe. Just imagine being on this boat for 66 days, a little boat, roughly 1 foot of boat for every passenger. Of course, the width of the boat makes up for that a little bit, but it is not going to be a pleasant voyage for these people. So those were the early crossings of the Atlantic. Then gradually transatlantic clippers evolved. around the 1800s. And these were big boats, about 250 feet long, carried 200 passengers. And they took anywhere from 21 to 40 days. And some of the passages were very, very rough. Here's a picture taken from the front of a clipper ship. And you could see that it was in very rough seas. The captains of clipper ships were desperate to make the fastest passage across the Atlantic. They were more concerned about the speed of the passage, actually, than they were, I think, about the safety of their passengers. So it was not unusual for them to keep their sails up in extremely, extremely rough conditions. And I actually experienced one of those. The Sea Cloud is actually a modern-ish sailing boat that was made in 1936, measured 360 feet long, a bit longer than some of the clippers. And it was made by an extraordinarily rich person as their private yacht. But it is now accessible. You can go on the Sea Cloud, and it takes 42 passengers now. If it had been a clipper, it would have been 200 and some odd passengers. So kind of a luxury cruise. If you come across the Atlantic on the Sea Cloud, it takes about 12 days to get across the Atlantic. And I took 2 voyages on the Sea Cloud. In the second voyage, the wind started building, and they started building up past 20 knots to 30 knots to 40 knots. And I kept expecting the captain to take down the sails. We're talking 36 sails on the Sea Cloud, 36 sails when all the sails were up, and he left all the sails up. And a beautiful thing about the Sea Cloud is run by the National Geographic Lindblad organization, and they have an absolute ironclad policy that passengers can go on the bridge of the ship at any time, regardless of what's going on the bridge. So I was just up there in the bridge watching the wind speed meter, and I had to look and look and look. I couldn't believe my eyes. The wind actually peaked at 55 knots with all of the sails up on the Sea Cloud. Now, in my sailboat, if a wind had hit 55 knots, even if I had no sails up, all the sails down, just the mast sticking up, that wind would have laid me right over on my side and probably rolled the boat upside down. So these ships were amazingly strong, and the captains knew what they were doing. This man who was the captain of Sea Cloud really knew his stuff, and I was absolutely amazed that we survived that. After the great clipper ships, there began to be boats that combined both steam and sail. The Great Eastern in 1858 was a hybrid ship in which there were steam propulsion using the paddle wheels that you see on the side, as well as a total of 6 masts for all of the sails. And these boats were, in this case, the Great Eastern, about 700 feet long. It carried 4,000 passengers, and it took 15 days. Again, not the most comfortable voyage, I would think, even in a boat that is that long. But that was the beginning of ocean liner travel. This wasn't quite an ocean liner, but it was moving in that direction. Then we had this group of grand old ocean liners throughout time. I'm going to be talking about first the Titanic. In 1912, it carried 1,300 passengers, and it was 883 feet long, a little bit like the boat we just saw. We're going to talk about the Titanic II, which is under construction in 2026. Then we're going to go to the Queen Mary, which was built in 1936, a little bit longer, not very significantly, 1,000 feet long. And then we're going to talk about the Queen Mary II. And it, again, very similar, roughly 1,000 1,100 feet long, and a few more passengers, 2,700 passengers. And we're going to end up talking about the United States, which was built in 1952. And again, roughly the same length, about 1,000 feet long, 2,000 passengers. That size of the boats is sort of dictated by what could get through the Panama Canal. If you got any bigger than that, you couldn't fit through the Panama Canal. And often these ships had to reposition themselves to the Pacific Ocean from time to time. So let's start looking at the Titanic, built in 1912, designed for 1,300 passengers, plus or minus, 883 feet long. And it was an amazing ship at this point. Its builders thought that they would be able to claim the transatlantic speed record. And the big goal for all of these ships was to cross the Atlantic as fast as they possibly could to be the record setter, the fastest boat across the ocean. And of course, unfortunately, the Titanic never made it across the ocean, so we don't know what its speed would have been. Anyway, the Titanic had huge propellers. I'm going to take the liberty of showing some pictures from the movie Titanic and some original pictures of the Titanic, just to give us a complete picture of this boat. These are the propellers on the back of the Titanic as seen in the movie. This is an actual picture of the purser desk on the Titanic. The inside of the Titanic was absolutely beautiful. It was laid out with great luxury. The grand staircase in the Titanic was a work of art and became quite famous among people who follow various boats. And in the top of the grand staircase, you can just see this huge glass dome that stuck up into the air and allowed light in. So the grand staircase was a major part of the inside of the Titanic. There were elegant sitting rooms and card rooms that you see here, and the dining room was very elegant. This is the first class dining room in the Titanic. They even had special chinaware for the first class dining room. Second class dining room, a little bit less elegant, but still a magnificent area. And the first class bedrooms were works of art, picture of how it would look inside a first class bedroom. Interestingly enough, the Titanic had no windows in any of the staterooms, so they had portholes. And the designers thought it wouldn't be too elegant to have a porthole on the side of your elegant first class bedroom. So they designed stained glass windows that would swing in front of the portholes. And when this stained glass window is closed, it looks like it's light from outside right on the other side of the stained glass window. You didn't have to see this presumably not very appealing looking porthole. So lots of luxury in this boat. This is a second class bedroom, and you can see you have to be a bit of a gymnast to get up into that bunk on the left side. And in the third class bedroom, you had to be even more of a gymnast, and you had to give up a lot of luxury, but they were very inexpensive if you went over in third class on the Titanic. Of course, the Titanic had an elaborate exercise room, keep your muscles in shape, and Madame didn't have to give up her daily horseback ride on the Titanic. She could ride the Titanic exercise horse that we see on the left. And indeed, one of the exercise horses on the Titanic was actually recovered on one of the dives and is on display in one of the Titanic museums. There was also an elaborate Turkish bath on the Titanic. So we're talking about a very, very elegant and refined area for a person to cross the ocean on. And the philosophy was generally you want to feel that you're at home when you cross the ocean. And I guess that for the very wealthy, an environment like this seemed like home. The Titanic is also duplicated in various places. There are many Titanic museums and replicas out there. This one is in Branson, Missouri, one of the most elaborate of these. And if you go inside this museum, you see some of the relics that have been recovered from the Titanic. This is the violin of the bandmaster named Wallace Henry Hartley, who kept on playing as the boat sank. And this violin was recovered, and it was sold for $1.7 million. So, of course, the people who recovered it made a lot of money on that recovery. And it raises the question of whether it is ethically reasonable to recover artifacts from the sinking of the Titanic with that tremendous loss of lives, or whether they should be left there in perpetuity. Here's another artifact, a hat which was recovered from the Titanic, and it's on display in one of these museums. And the controversy goes on and on and on regarding the appropriateness, ethics, legality even, of removing artifacts from historic wrecks. And I imagine it'll never be settled, and it goes on as we speak. The Titanic's maiden voyage left England, and as you can see, that little triangle in the middle, they were warned about icebergs ahead. But it was clear that the captain of the Titanic wanted very badly to set the world speed record across the Atlantic. And so he kept the Titanic screaming along at or near its top speed for as long as he could, and unfortunately ended up running into an iceberg. And when he hit that iceberg, the Titanic started sending out emergency signals. And the unfortunate thing is that in those days, all of the other ships that were out there on the ocean had wireless stations, radio stations, and they had the capability of receiving the Titanic's emergency call for help, SOS, save our ship, or CQ, come quickly. And unfortunately, there was no ruling that radio operators had to stay awake all night. And so they didn't have a 24-hour shift. Many of the radio operators on these other boats had gone to sleep and never received the message from the Titanic. So that was one of the things that contributed to the tremendous loss of life and delay in rescuing people from the Titanic. Another one was, of course, here's a picture of a radio operator in a similar radio room, and you can't very well expect him to stay awake for 24 hours, and they didn't bother having people on shifts at that point. The second problem was that the Titanic fired flares, but they fired the wrong flares. The appropriate flare when you're in trouble, you shoot up a flare that is red in color. And for some reason, the Titanic's flare guns fired white flares. And although it was a perfectly clear night and there were ships within sight of the Titanic, they saw these white flares going up in the air, and they said, oh, that's the Titanic. They're having a celebration. They're having a party. They're just sending up flares to celebrate the party. So nobody knew that the Titanic was in trouble because the colors of the flares were wrong. They should have been red, and they just didn't consider the white flares to be a distress call. Another contribution to the tragedy was the use of rivets as opposed to welding to hold the plates on the side of the Titanic together. And when you rivet plates together, you're totally dependent on the rivets. And there is some suspicion after recovering some of these rivets that the rivets were of inferior metals, that they were a little too soft, that they bent. And if you hit an iceberg, you're going to stress those rivets pretty severely. And even if they bend a little bit, you can see that seam between two plates on the side of the Titanic in the middle of this illustration. If the rivet bends, it's going to let water in that seam, and that is going to contribute to the flooding of the inside of the Titanic. Another contributing problem that led to the sinking of the Titanic was that although it had very modern watertight bulkheads between different compartments, A, B, C, D, E, F, G were all watertight compartments, they had somehow managed to leave the tops of these compartments open. So what happened was the Titanic hit the iceberg, and it flooded the first few compartments, A, B, C. And as the water rose higher and higher, it poured over into compartment E and F and G. And that caused the front of the Titanic to sink faster because even more water was pouring in. And the increased weight of the water in D, E, F, G helped pull it down. That's why the Titanic sank bow first after the collision with the iceberg. So a number of problems with the design. And of course, another problem was that there were not anywhere near enough lifeboats, and the sailors had not been trained adequately in filling a lifeboat before you release the lifeboat. And some of the lifeboats couldn't be released at all because they were on the side of the Titanic that was up in the air, and they couldn't get them down in the water. So a lot of people died because they couldn't get into lifeboats. The water temperature was 28 degrees. Salt water can actually reach a temperature below that of fresh water. So it was very, very cold water. And you can't stay alive in 28-degree water for very long. So we have the loss of the Titanic as one of the great sea tragedies of all time. And we move on to the Titanic II. The Titanic II was an exact replica of the Titanic. And the Titanic II is the brainchild of a very, very wealthy businessman named Clive Palmer. And he set about raising money to build an exact replica of the Titanic, which he planned to launch initially in the year 2000, and he kept putting off the launch date. His idea came from studying the Titanic. This is a model of the Titanic as it's sitting on the bottom, and asking, how could I build an exact replica of the ship that wouldn't be susceptible to any of this kind of damage? And so he designed the Titanic II to be an absolute replica of everything in the Titanic, the grand staircase, the radio room, the first-class staterooms, and the boat itself. And in addition to that, he was going to equip, or is going to equip the Titanic II with the most modern navigation equipment, including radar, make it virtually impossible to run into an iceberg or another ship. And if it should happen, he was going, or is going to equip the Titanic II with an ample number of lifeboats that would be released not by arms that swung out from the boat and could be impaired by the listing or tilting of the boat, by a special releasing device that would allow the lifeboats to be released regardless of the angle that the boat was resting at. The lifeboats wouldn't look quite right if they were in his initial design. And so he wanted to have a boat that looked exactly like the Titanic, and he was going to cover the lifeboats with metal plates that, or actually wooden plates that hid the lifeboats and yet were allowed them to be launched at any point. The Titanic II is being constructed in a shipyard in China, and there have been just delay after delay after delay. And if you try and research it, you get all sorts of possible dates. I would love to be on the first voyage, the maiden voyage of the Titanic II, and I've got a request in, but so far we don't know when it's going to happen. So that's the Titanic II. While he is building the Titanic II, the Chinese people decided that they would build an exact replica of the Titanic. I'm not quite sure. It wasn't China, but they decided that would make that as a national priority. And so they planned a Titanic II amusement park in which the Titanic II would be extremely accurately reproduced. Again, in all respects, it would be identical to the original Titanic. And since it wouldn't be out in the ocean, but just floating in a little pond next to the amusement park, they didn't have to worry about life preservers and life rafts. They could make it really an accurate replica of the Titanic. And you can see there are Ferris wheels, and there's a little restaurant in the middle there with four smokestacks sticking out of it, the Titanic Bar and Grill. And it's going to be an amazing place. And believe it or not, it is under construction. Here's a picture, recent picture of the Titanic II amusement park. And you can see it's real serious construction there. It's all being built the way the Titanic was with steel. And it's going to be quite a place to visit. And they wanted it to be as absolutely accurate as possible. So along with all of their plans, they also decided they would make an iceberg crash simulation. So you're on this boat, and without warning, all of a sudden, the boat starts shaking, and then the bow starts sinking, and you've struck an iceberg. And this is a simulation. Well, they simulated the simulation, and the people who they showed this to were so terrified by the experience that the people building the amusement park decided that they would abandon it rather than having their customers experience heart attacks and panic attacks from the crash or the simulated crash of the Titanic. So that's the current state of the Titanic II. They sort of settled for having horrible pictures of the Titanic on the walls, which are pretty much scary enough for the people who attended. So let's move on to the Queen Mary. Queen Mary was built in 1936. It was designed again to be a very fast liner, cross the ocean as quickly as possible. It was a beautiful liner, three stacks, and it was built in the classic Art Deco style of the 1930s. So here are some pictures inside the Queen Mary. And you can see the elegant but rather modern looking interior. Here is the grand dining room inside the Queen Mary, and an hors d'oeuvre area, the dining room, and one of the bars in the Queen Mary, and one of the sitting rooms. This is a second-class dining room, nice windows to look out of, and typical a second-class bedroom in the Queen Mary, and the bridge of the Queen Mary, well equipped with all the most modern nautical equipment of 1936. The Queen Mary hit some very heavy seas. And here's a picture of the Queen Mary going across the Atlantic, and you can see it's in very, very heavy seas. And one of the problems was that the Queen Mary had very poor lateral stability, which means it tended to roll a great deal. And here's a picture drawn by a passenger on the Queen Mary on the trip across the Atlantic, in which the bridge recorded a 45-degree roll of the ship. Now you can imagine here that the top of this ship is heavy. And if that ship rolled any further, you can imagine the top of the ship just being so heavy that it would just keep on rolling, and the boat would end up completely upside down. There's a critical angle for every boat beyond which you cannot expect it to go upright again. And obviously, the Queen Mary had an angle that was less than greater than 45 degrees, because it did survive this 45-degree roll. The passengers were so terrified by this that many of them wrote stories about it. And interestingly enough, one of the passengers decided he would make a movie about it. It was so terrifying for him. The Queen Mary, by the way, had been tested in a simulated ocean, a great model, exact model of the Queen Mary that you see, simulated ocean, but obviously the ocean, simulated ocean, wasn't as rough as the real ocean, and the Queen Mary was not adequately tested. And anyway, the passenger made a movie which we recognize now as the Poseidon Adventure. If you've seen this movie, it's an amazing movie in which the passengers on a luxury liner across the Atlantic experience a roll. The boat rolls so far that it actually turns completely upside down. And the passengers, most of the movie is involved in how the passengers found their way to the very bottom of the boat, which was now the very top of the boat, and cut holes in the bottom, and they came out through the boat into the air again. So the Poseidon Adventure was modeled after that 45-degree roll in the Queen Mary. The Queen Mary also carried huge numbers of troops during World War II. And as far as I can tell, they never had to deal with extremely rough seas. I haven't heard of any like that. But if you look down at the lower part of this picture on the right, you'll see that in addition to the normal lifeboats on the Queen Mary, they strapped hundreds of additional or dozens of additional life rafts on board, so that if the boat was in a very severe storm, or more likely was struck by a German torpedo, the crew would be able to get off and the sailors would be able to get off on an adequate number of lifeboats. So the history of the Queen Mary is really quite fascinating. And the Queen Mary can actually be visited in person in Long Beach, California. You can go and you can stay in the Queen Mary Hotel in Long Beach and experience the luxury of this wonderful and very historic boat that survived so well and for so long. Let's move on to the Queen Mary II. This is the boat that my wife and I decided to sail on. And the Queen Mary II was really built to be a kind of a replica of the Queen Mary, but not exactly. And as you can see, many of the cabins on the Queen Mary II actually have windows and outside porches, and the boat is higher. So it's not an exact replica in appearance to the Queen Mary, but it was designed to have many features that were absolutely identical to the Queen Mary. One of these was the overall structure of the boat, very strongly built. I love this picture of the boat Queen Mary II being built. But one of the features was the horn on the Queen Mary II. The Queen Mary had a very, very distinctive horn. And when they blew that horn, it gave a rumbling, low rumbling sound. And they wanted the Queen Mary II to have exactly the same sound. And since the Queen Mary horns were driven by steam, they had to drive the horns on the Queen Mary by compressed air. And they actually went to a machine shop, and they had the horns on the Queen Mary II, which you see here, made as exact duplicates of the horns on the Queen Mary. So the sound that the Queen Mary II makes when it's blowing its horn is identical to that of the Queen Mary. The Queen Mary II leaves New York in the Brooklyn cruise ship terminal. And it has this really weird sign as you're getting on the Queen Mary II. It says, "Leaving Brooklyn, forget about it." Forget about it? I never understood this sign, but it's a strange thing. Anyway, you get on the Queen Mary II and you try and find your stateroom, and the passageways are incredibly long, about an eighth of a mile long. And so you're walking along these looking at your room number, and it's overwhelming, the size of these passageways. The number of decks we see from deck 1 up to deck 13, and every elevator and staircase has one of these little guides, so help you find your way around the ship, but it's still very easy to get lost on the Queen Mary II. Here's a stateroom, second-class stateroom on the Queen Mary II. This is our stateroom. Very comfortable, not super elegant, but more than comfortable, and a lot better than a business class reclining seat in a jet plane, as far as I'm concerned. This is the Queen Mary II equivalent of the grand staircase. Not quite the same, but there is a big glass dome overhead, and it's a little bit bigger than the original grand staircase and has a nice feeling of size about it. This is the dining room, one of the dining rooms on the Queen Mary II. In the foreground is the second class dining room where we were. Up on the balcony, you can just barely see in the background is the first class dining room. And if you are in third class, you eat in the cafeteria. Now, the cafeteria is absolutely amazing. It is a humongous, huge cafeteria with an incredible assortment of available food. So you're not missing out on much in terms of eating in the cafeteria. The deck has an area you can walk all the way around the deck, mostly covered, so you can go for your daily walk around the deck, pretty well isolated from weather. If you'd make 3 laps around the deck, that is 1.1 miles, so roughly a third of a mile per circuit of the deck. And here's a picture of the deck, and pretty well sheltered from the weather, and a good place to get exercise. As you're walking around the deck, you pass by some spare blades for the propellers that are stored up there. So if there's damage to a propeller, you can actually remove the blades on the propellers and replace them with this without stopping your voyage totally, without having to go into a shipyard. Typical bar on the Queen Mary II, and the casino, little casino, but with wonderful wall painting showing the casino on the Queen Mary. Other wall carvings on the wall of the Queen Mary II, and along the walls are a lot of historic signs and documents that are similar to those or exactly the same as those that were on the original Queen Mary. This one shows that the Queen Mary itself, the original Queen Mary, measured slightly less tall than the Empire State Building, but slightly taller or longer, I should say, than the Eiffel Tower, than the Washington Monument, and St. Patrick's Cathedral, and so on, off to the right. So an idea of what it was like. The wall illustrations are historical. Here's an illustration dedicated to the Titanic and the call for help on the Titanic. One of the really interesting things about the trip on the Queen Mary II was that the captain was absolutely fixated on the sinking of the Titanic, and he would give our position on the ocean not in terms of how far we were from New York or how far we were from Southampton in England. He gave it in how far we were from where the Titanic sank. And he actually did a countdown. He sailed on purpose right over the location of the Titanic. And they said, we're 2 miles from the Titanic, we're 1 mile from the Titanic, half a mile, a quarter of a mile. Now we are over the Titanic. Not maybe the best thing to tell people on a boat, but he made a big deal out of it. There were also some wonderful little illustrations of what it was like to sail on the Titanic or on the Queen Mary. It simply isn't considered smart to appear too opulent. This refers to the wonderful dress-up days that they had for dinner every day on the Titanic and the Queen Mary. And on the Queen Mary too, there are a couple of optional dress-up evenings in which everybody puts on their tuxedos and prances around, has a wonderful time. A bunch of things that were quoted as having been asked of the captain. Captain, when does this place get there? And another illustration on the wall shows the proper setup of place settings of knives and forks for a person's dinner setting. You look on the right, you see the main knife, the entree knife, the fish knife, the soup spoon, and the side knife. And on the left, the main fork, the entree fork, and the fish fork, and the fruit knife and the fruit fork, and so on. Just wonderful little glimpses back into the past of ocean liner travel. This is a view of the bridge on the Queen Mary 2. You were allowed to look through a window at the bridge. You couldn't go on the bridge, and they would occasionally close the window when they were maneuvering, as they put it. I imagine they just didn't want people making movies that they could then use for a lawsuit if something went wrong. But it's a very modern bridge and very typical of very large boats of that type. The exercise room, not quite a horse to ride on, as we saw on the Titanic, but plenty of exercise machines available, and a swimming pool, of course, which was also available for exercising. The United States is the next boat that we're going to look at, and that is a boat that was made in 1952, and it actually was, again, about the same length as the other boats, carried 2,000 passengers. And the United States was the boat that set the speed record across the Atlantic, the last ocean liner speed record. It was 3 days and 10 hours across the Atlantic. That was the United States speed record at that time. Looking inside the United States, typical 50s decor, and we see the first class ballroom and the first class smoking room, and the waiters lined up for inspection before dinner, and the first class dining room, and one of the bars, and dancing to various orchestras in the United States. Now, in the United States was designed by a person who was absolutely fixated and obsessed by safety. First of all, he designed the entire superstructure, upper part of the boat, out of aluminum so that it would be lighter and less likely to pull the boat over if it was in very severe seas. He also insisted that every single thing on the United States be fireproof, and that included the piano. So he ordered an aluminum piano from the Steinway piano company, and the Steinway piano company refused to make him an aluminum piano. But they did say, listen, we're not going to make a Steinway piano out of aluminum. What we will do is prove to you that our Steinway piano is fireproof. And so they took a Steinway piano, they opened it like this and poured a gallon of gasoline on it and lit the gasoline on fire. And sure enough, the gasoline burned, but ultimately the Steinway piano did not catch fire. And so this is one of the very few things on the United States that was not fireproof. I always got a kick of that story. Everybody had fun. Here we are popping some champagne. This is a first class bedroom on the United States, and second class bedroom. You can see you have to be a bit athletic to get up into that bunk, and a swimming pool and a deck area to walk around the United States, and the bridge of the United States. So it was a very popular ship and made many crossings of the Atlantic Ocean, often called the First Lady of the Seas. And unfortunately, over the years, the number of people that signed up to ride on the United States gradually decreased to the point where they simply could not get enough passengers. And so recently, in 2025, the United States was towed by that tugboat that you see there all the way down the east coast of America around Florida into the Gulf, and it is being prepared to be a dive site in the Gulf where people can go and dive and explore the Titanic after it has been sunk there on purpose. The passing of the Titanic as it went by Key West was captured by one man. You could see it had to be outside the reef, but you can see the characteristic two smokestacks on the vessel. So we've looked at the Titanic, we've looked at the Titanic II, we've looked at the Queen Mary II, and the United States. And this gives a pretty fair picture of the ocean liners, and you've had a chance to see inside some of them. What about the times? Well, we see that there was a gradual drop off in the amount of time it took to cross the Atlantic Ocean, with the United States holding the record of 3 days and 10 hours that you see over on the right. The other question is, what about flying across the ocean? Well, the very first passenger carrying aircraft to cross the Atlantic Ocean was the Boeing B-314 in 1939. It carried 74 passengers, and it took a total of 27 hours to cross the Atlantic. Of course, it had to stop for fuel in the Azores. That's why it took so long. By 1945, right at the end of World War II, the American DC-4, with 44 passengers on board, was able to make the crossing in 16 hours. And by 1958, when the first jet, Boeing 707, crossed the Atlantic, it was carrying 111 passengers, and it took a total of about 9 hours to cross the Atlantic Ocean. So that's a tour of the history of these liners crossing the United States and crossing from the United States to Europe. And I hope you've enjoyed that. Maybe I'll see you on board the Queen Mary II. Thanks for watching.